It was a cold, rainy evening when I started my new job as the night shift receptionist at the Crescent Inn, a small, old fashioned hotel in the heart of a forgotten town. The inn had been around for over a century, its walls echoing with countless stories and secrets. I never believed in the supernatural, but my first night on the job would challenge everything I thought I knew. The inn had 13 rooms, and my boss, Mr. Hargrove, warned me about room 13. "We don't rent out that room," he said with a stern look. "It's bad luck, and there have been incidents." I laughed it off, thinking it was just a local superstition. The shift started quietly enough, with only a few guests trickling in. Around midnight, a heavy storm rolled in, thunder shaking the windows and lightning illuminating the dark hallways intermittently. I was sitting at the front desk, scrolling through my phone, when an elderly woman entered the lobby, drenched from the rain. She looked frail and exhausted, her eyes pleading for shelter. "Please, I need a room for the night," she said, her voice trembling. I checked the register. Only one room was available, room 13. Remembering Mr. Hargrove's warning, I hesitated, but seeing her pitiful state, I relented. "We have one room left," I said, "but it's room 13. Are you sure you want it?" She nodded vigorously, clearly desperate. I handed her the key, feeling a pang of guilt as she shuffled towards the elevator. The hours dragged on, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Around 2 a.m., the inn's power flickered and the lights went out. The emergency generator kicked in, casting eerie shadows throughout the lobby. I felt a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, the phone rang. It was a soft, persistent ring that seemed to echo in the silence. I picked it up, but there was no answer, just a faint, static noise. "Hello?" I called out, but the line went dead. Moments later, the elevator dinged, and I saw the old woman stepping out. She looked different, paler, her eyes wide with fear. "There's something in the room," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "In the mirror." I escorted her back to the lobby, trying to calm her down. "What did you see?" I asked, but she just shook her head, unable to speak. I decided to check room 13 myself, convinced it was just her imagination playing tricks. The hallway leading to room 13 felt colder than the rest of the inn. As I approached the door, my heart pounded in my chest. I inserted the key and slowly pushed the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the lightning flashing outside the window. I turned on the bedside lamp and walked over to the mirror above the dresser. It was an old, ornate piece, its surface slightly tarnished. I stared at my reflection, expecting to see something out of the ordinary, but it was just me, tired and nervous. Suddenly, the air grew thick, and I felt a presence behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. Turning back to the mirror, I gasped. My reflection was still there, but it was wrong. My eyes were black voids, and a sinister smile twisted my lips. Frozen in fear, I watched as the reflection raised its hand and pointed directly at me. I stumbled back, breaking the mirror's gaze, and the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I fumbled for the handle, yanking the door open and bolting down the hallway. Back in the lobby, the old woman was gone. I checked the register. There was no record of her ever checking in. Panicking, I called Mr. Hargrove and told him everything. He arrived within minutes, his face grim. "We need to leave," he said urgently. "This place, it's cursed." As we drove away from the inn, Mr. Hargrove explained that room 13 had been the scene of a tragic event decades ago. A young woman had died there under mysterious circumstances, and ever since, strange occurrences had plagued the room. I never went back to the Crescent Inn, but I'll never forget that night. The old woman, the mirror, and the sinister reflection haunt my dreams. Sometimes I wake up convinced that my own reflection is watching me, waiting for the right moment to cross over and take my place. When I received an invitation to stay at Holloway Mansion, I was skeptical. The mansion had a notorious reputation in our small town, known for its eerie history and the tales of those who dared to spend a night within its walls. But the invitation came from an old friend, Laura, who assured me it was just a fun, spooky experience, perfect for a Halloween weekend. The mansion loomed large on a hill, its Gothic architecture casting long shadows under the pale moonlight. As I approached, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the crisp autumn air. Laura greeted me at the door, her excitement palpable. "You're going to love this," she said. Leading me inside, the interior of the mansion was as grand as it was unsettling. High ceilings, antique furniture, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls. Laura had invited a few other friends, and we gathered in the grand parlor, sharing ghost stories and sipping on wine. As the night grew darker, Laura suggested we explore the house. We wandered through dusty corridors and up creaking staircases, each room more ominous than the last. Eventually, we reached the attic, a place Laura claimed was the most haunted part of the mansion. The attic was cluttered with old trunks, forgotten toys, and cobweb-covered furniture. In the center of the room stood an antique mirror, its surface darkened with age. Laura dared us to look into it, saying that legend had it you could see the spirits trapped in the mansion. One by one, we took turns gazing into the mirror. When it was my turn, I hesitated, feeling a strange pull. As I stared into the glass, my reflection began to waver. Shadows seemed to move behind me, and a figure slowly emerged, an old woman with hollow eyes and a mournful expression. I stumbled back, my heart racing. Laura laughed, thinking I was just playing along, but the terror in my eyes must have convinced her otherwise. We decided to call it a night and headed back to our rooms, though the image of the woman in the mirror lingered in my mind. I barely slept, the creaks and groans of the old mansion keeping me on edge. At around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud crash. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way down the hall, the beam cutting through the darkness. The noise had come from the dining room. The grand chandelier had fallen, shards of crystal scattered across the floor. In the center of the chaos stood a shadowy figure, the same old woman from the mirror. She raised her head and our eyes met. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Instead, I heard the whispers, soft, mournful, and full of sorrow. Frozen in fear, I watched as the woman slowly dissolved into the shadows. I ran back to my room, heart pounding, and locked the door behind me. The rest of the night passed in a tense silence, and I counted the minutes until dawn. The next morning, I found Laura and the others in the parlor. They looked as shaken as I felt. Laura confessed that she had seen the old woman too, and that the chandelier had fallen with no apparent cause. We decided to leave the mansion immediately, not wanting to spend another night in its haunted halls. As we packed our things, Laura shared the story she had uncovered about the mansion. The old woman was Eleanor Holloway, the original owner. She had lived alone in the mansion for years after the tragic deaths of her husband and children. Consumed by grief, she had spent her final days in the attic, staring into the mirror, hoping to see her family again. It was said that her spirit remained, trapped by her sorrow and longing. We left Holloway Mansion with a new understanding of its haunted past. The image of Eleanor's hollow eyes stayed with me, a reminder of the sorrow that lingered in those ancient walls. Despite the terror, I felt a strange sense of connection to her, a lonely soul lost in the echoes of time. Disclaimer: the following story contains themes that may be disturbing to some viewers, including stalking and psychological distress. Viewer discretion is advised. I had always considered myself a private person. Living alone in a small apartment in the heart of the city, I relished the anonymity that came with the hustle and bustle of urban life. My days were spent working at a marketing firm, and My evenings were reserved for quiet solitude, often spent with a good book or a favorite TV show. It all started innocuously enough. One evening, as I was returning home from work, I noticed a man standing across the street from my apartment building. He was nondescript, dressed in dark clothes, and he seemed to be staring directly at me. I brushed it off, assuming he was just waiting for someone or perhaps lost in thought. Days turned into weeks, and I began to notice the man more frequently. He was always there, standing at a distance, never approaching, but always watching. His presence became a constant, unsettling backdrop to my life. I told myself I was being paranoid, that he was just a coincidence, a figment of my imagination. One night, I returned home later than usual. The street was quieter than usual, the usual hum of traffic and city life reduced to a distant murmur. As I approached my building, I saw him again, standing under a street lamp. This time, there was no mistaking it. He was staring directly at me. A chill ran down my spine, and I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old building, every distant siren set my nerves on edge. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with possibilities. Who was this man? What did he want? Why was he following me? The next day at work, I confided in my colleague and close friend, Sarah. She listened sympathetically, but her rational mind attributed it to stress and overwork. "You're just tired," she said. "Take a few days off, get some rest. I'm sure it's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. Over the next few days, the man's presence grew more oppressive. I began to see him everywhere, in the grocery store, outside my office, even in the coffee shop I frequented. His persistence was terrifying. I felt like a prisoner in my own life, constantly looking over my shoulder, my anxiety escalating with each passing day. One evening, after a particularly long day, I decided to confront him. Fueled by a mix of fear and anger, I marched across the street where he was standing. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "Why are you following me?" He said nothing, just stared at me with those cold, unblinking eyes. His silence was more unsettling than any response could have been. I backed away, my heart pounding, and fled back to my apartment. That night, I called the police. They took my statement, but without any direct threats or evidence of wrongdoing, there was little they could do. "We'll keep an eye out," the officer assured me, "but be cautious. Keep your doors locked and call us if anything happens." The sense of helplessness was overwhelming. I felt trapped, with no escape from the shadow that loomed over my life. I decided to install security cameras around my apartment, hoping they would provide some sense of safety and perhaps capture evidence of his stalking. A few nights later, as I was reviewing the footage from the cameras, I saw him again. He was standing in the shadows, just outside the building, his face partially obscured. But this time, he did something different. He stepped forward, and for the first time, I saw his face clearly. My blood ran cold. It was a face I recognized, a former client from my marketing firm. He had been difficult to work with, often crossing professional boundaries and making inappropriate comments. I had reported him to my superiors, and he was eventually let go. I had forgotten about him, or so I thought. The realization that this wasn't a random stranger, but someone with a personal vendetta, made the situation even more terrifying. I called the police again, providing them with the footage and explaining the history. This time, they took it more seriously, promising to increase patrols in my area. Despite their assurances, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. I rarely left, relying on friends and delivery services to get by. The sense of isolation was crushing, but The fear of encountering him again kept me confined. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a noise outside my window. It was a soft tapping, barely audible but persistent. I crept to the window, peering through the blinds. There he was, standing on the fire escape, staring in at me. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed my phone to call the police. Before I could dial, he spoke. His voice was muffled by the glass, but I could make out the words, "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to talk." Terror paralyzed me. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to get out. I grabbed my keys and fled the apartment, running down the stairs and out into the street. I didn't stop until I reached a nearby convenience store, where I called the police again. They arrived quickly, and after a thorough search, they found him still on the fire escape. He was arrested and charged with stalking and harassment. As they led him away, he stared at me, his expression unreadable. The ordeal left me shaken, but I was determined to reclaim my life. I moved to a new apartment in a different part of the city, changed my routines, and took self-defense classes. The fear never completely went away, but I refused to let it control me. Months later, I received a letter from Sarah. Inside was a small note. "You're stronger than you think. Stay safe." It was a reminder that, despite the darkness, I wasn't alone. And with that knowledge, I began to rebuild, one day at a time.